I'm Derek Wheatley, and welcome to episode 178 of the Weekly podcast. Thank you very much for joining us wherever you are doing so. A massive thank you to our guest last week, Maggie Deering, who came on and spoke about art and painting, but also about the mammoth task she had of restoring the lovely house she has down in Carlow and the Airbnb and stuff she has on the go down there now. But I would suggest, if you did want to go on a little bit of a holiday, go down there, because it's such an amazing house that was. And this is funny because it ties in perfectly with today's episode, but it goes a long way back, goes back to 1840, and the history behind this and stuff is she's fascinated by. And yeah, check it out. You can also support us on Buy Me Coffee. So this week's guest is a professor of archaeology at UCD. Her name is Joanna Bruck. How are you, Joanna?
Good, great. Thanks very much for having me on, Derek.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thank you very much for coming on. I'm like I said to you before we start recording, bit of nerves on my side due to the subject matter, but a lot of excitement as well, because I think it's a fascinating topic that I haven't dipped into enough. It's one of those subject matters where when you go to museums and stuff, it's like, oh, this is amazing. Look at all this, these artifacts of the past. And it's almost like you leave them behind not yourself, obviously, but it's always like you leave them behind in the museum. And then the next museum you go to, you're like thrilled by the idea of these, artifacts and stories and all. So yeah, I guess that's why I wanted to have you on, really, to talk about it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, archaeology is a great subject. Obviously, I'd say that.
Well, of course, and we're going to be getting into a lot of it today, and I'm like I say, I'm looking forward to it. We always ask we always start in the same place, Joanna. So, could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
Yeah, well, I suppose I was born in Dublin, but spent a lot of my childhood in Cork and Dublin. So, my dad's a geologist, and my mum is very interested in history. So I suppose they'd always have been dragging me around the countryside. And we just stopped at any kind of historic site or archaeological site. So castles, early medieval churches, Ogham stones, standing stones, souterrains, whatever it all was, we'd be hopping over fields, over gates. Don't do this at home, people.
Yeah.
Going into farmers' fields and looking at stuff on our holidays. That's, what we did, really. So I've always been interested in ancient things.
Were you when you were that age? Because when parents are bringing kids to places, they're not always immediately enamored by what they're seeing. Were you a child of who was someone who was fascinated by these things from a young age?
Yeah, I think I must have been a bit weird at that. I've tried to brainwash my kids now and bring them to archaeological sites and museums, but glazed eyes, totally not interested, which of course is like a lot of kids nowadays. I was always really interested. And actually my dad had a couple of really lovely books, kind of probably in 1940s, 1950s kids books, big format, beautiful illustrations of all sorts of really interesting, exotic archaeological sites, Maya sites in the jungle, or, Middle Eastern early farming sites, and, all sorts of different things. And I guess I just kind of got sucked into the fantasy side of it, that you could be in another whole world. So when I was out visiting sites with my folks, when we were on holiday in Kerry or whatever it would have been back in the mid 1980s, it just transported me, going and seeing these places, just trying to imagine what they might have been like, how the people might have lived, what kinds of stories that might have been associated with these places. I just always loved all that side of things. I don't know anything about Irish folklore, but back in those days, I was really fascinated by all that kind of side of things too. Now I work on stuff that's much, much earlier, but so I've always loved it, and I never really wanted to be anything else, to be honest.
That's amazing, because we spoke a little bit last week. When I was talking to Maggie about the ideas of being outside, and she was talking about living in a kind of rural area and being out by lakes and out in fields and jumping off hay bales and stuff. And like you say about your parents bringing you to the places and that. And it's kind of like, I'm not I don't want to kind of come on and say, oh, like bash and like computer games and stuff like that, because they have their own place as well. But there is something beautiful about the idea of, taking your kids to these places from an early age and getting them, getting them interested in these things, because you can do both. Like, it doesn't have to be either or, but I think it's important to, particularly with history, something, a subject that I really love. I think it is important for us to see these sites and to learn, about the people and the places that were there and how they got through their own lives, which are obviously so much different than our own, really.
Yeah. And it's also about, I suppose, a sense of connection with place. And I always find that really, really important, that sense of, being grounded in a landscape and having a kind of an empathy for a sense of connection with somewhere, that it's a place of, home and heritage, and somewhere where, you feel you can belong, regardless of whether you necessarily have like a long lineage of ancestors going back to that place. None of my relatives came from Cork. I lived down there for a long time, but definitely have a strong sense of connection through having been out in those landscapes, and seen the places, and been out to the castles, and climbed up rickety staircases or whatever it would have been. And yeah, I just love those landscapes and those places. And I suppose, I mean, that's one of the really wonderful things about archaeology, is it is one of those jobs where you can be in the office sitting in front of a computer, or you can be outside, looking at amazing sites and excavating, and or you could be in a museum looking at objects, and they're all, it's very diverse as a career. And the outside element of it is really incredibly relaxing. The excavation or survey, or it's not always relaxing, obviously, but I'm sure my colleagues working in the commercial sector now, who are working to timetables, and they've got big road schemes or whatever coming down the tracks, it's a bit different. But certainly the research excavations that I would have been on over the years, it's a lovely way of kind of being in nature and connecting with place, and connecting with that the long histories of those places as well, and thinking who might have lived here before, and how do they think about this landscape, and what were their experiences, and did they have to deal with similar issues that maybe we have to deal with in the present. And I suppose it's always quite comforting in some ways to think, well, people have always lived through similar kinds of experiences, and got through them in one way or another, and think about how they might have coped, and all those kinds of things. So yeah.
Well, that kind of leads into the next question then, so when did you first become aware of mental health?
I suppose sort of over the years, gradually. I mean, I guess like anyone, I've had various ups and downs in my life, and I've been very lucky. I haven't had any serious mental health problems, but like anyone, I've had ups and downs in my life, and I would certainly have had periods where I've struggled, after, particularly difficult life events. So, and actually, I have to say, in the midst of one of those challenging life events, I went off digging to North Wales, and it was just so therapeutic, just because you're there, you're in the moment, you're troweling away there, your troweling away, trying to identify features, or find artifacts or whatever it might be, and it's very therapeutic. It's really therapeutic. And the same with I don't know, sometimes at 4 o'clock in the morning, if I'm worried about something and I can't sleep, I kind of imagine myself in a field doing geophysical survey, just walking up and down and up and down. It's quite meditative, actually. Excavation and archaeological excavation survey. It is, you're kind of there doing this kind of gentle, repetitive action, connecting with people in the past. So, I do, as I say, if I'm kind of stressed about something at 4 a.m, I just imagine myself troweling.
That's
not many people do that, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, I think it's every time I talk to someone who works outside, or part of their job is outside, I guess. So like we talk to a botanist, and then we talk to someone who goes around and protecting wildlife areas and things like that. And it always comes up about the kind of mindfulness of what they do within those jobs. Definitely. And it's that, like you say, like troweling away, and it's that kind of a repetitive nature of something, like, counting, like, because we talk to people who go into a small plot of land and have to count the flowers or count the different types of flowers that are in the field and stuff, and they find their mindfulness in that, like, and it's,
Oh yeah.
that peaceful moment, and it's,
Mm,
I think a lot of people struggle to find that, and it
mm,
is a joy to have
mm.
that moment. My thing is, I do jujitsu,
Yeah.
and it sounds a bit odd that, in the moment of someone trying to choke you, that you would find that moment of peace, but you do, because it's everything else is taken away,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
the struggles and anxieties and things
Yeah.
that you have.
Mm.
So to find a career like you have, where you have
Yeah.
those moments of peacefulness, it's really beautiful. And
Very
like,
lucky. I'm very lucky.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think, but like, almost like acknowledging and accepting that as a wonderful thing, because we often fight. Well, when I was at my lowest and in my darkest kind of days, you often fight against that. Like, it's a weird thing that happens in your brain. You know that something here is good for you, but you fight against it. It's almost like you
Mhm.
don't want to embrace that moment. And it's an odd thing, but it's the more I talk to people now, and even talking to yourself about trowelling, which is a word that I've never heard. Obviously, I know what a trowel is, but I didn't realize it's called trowelling. But that it's kind of heartwarming that when I find people who have found those moments of peace.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm very lucky. I think so. And it's not just the kind of the repetitive,
Mm,
meditative, peaceful nature of it. It's the connection with unknown others,
mm,
previous generations, the sense of, people reaching out to you from the past and supporting you. And, the idea that, they survived, they coped. And that does give you hope, and it does give you a sense of, I think it's being part of something bigger. I think that's what it
mm,
is. It's a bit like when you're out, if you're out in the mountains or, something like that, and nature is so big and so vast. And you feel insignificant, not in a bad way, but
yeah,
just like you're part of a bigger picture and you're part of a bigger world, and you don't feel alone, you feel part of something. And I think excavating definitely for me gives me that sense as well, that I'm just, I'm part of the human community in the
mm,
broadest possible sense, and that kind of thread of history that links you, because it's really easy, I think, in kind of modern, urban living, and everybody's so busy and so on, to feel very disconnected, and it's very difficult to make time to connect with friends and other people. So you're kind of forced to connect emotionally and
mm.
psychologically with these long dead former, generations when you're excavating somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. And so, if we were to think back, talking about someone coming into college and to study archaeology, what is the curriculum like with regards to, like, field studies, but also, obviously studies within the classroom and stuff? How is that split?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's usually now in, I think all Irish universities, it would be uh elected. Well, it's an option
Right.
within most programs to do excavation. So usually in our program, for example, in UCD, we do the basics in first year and second year, and then it's really in third year and fourth year, if people are doing the 4-year program, that they can choose options. And at that stage, then you can do kind of lab-based options, or actually in first year and second year are excavations. We have excavations that people can take part in as well. So it's not compulsory, but
Hmm.
most people who would be really interested in archaeology now would choose certainly to take those excavation modules. And then in third and fourth year, as I say, you can do kind of lab-based modules. You could be looking down a microscope, and again, that's kind of really taking you out of yourself, and
Yeah.
you're there looking at plant macrofossils and trying to identify what types of wheat or barley people ate in the past or something like that. So it's really, it's yeah, it's definitely very, very meditative, and it
Mm.
is kind of taking you out of yourself, and yeah, I suppose yeah, it's one of the things I guess I really like about archaeology is that it, it opens other worlds, and I suppose it's kind of other worlds of possibility. So on the one hand, it allows you, so depending on what, as an academic, I suppose I choose particular research topics and particular topics to study. And it took me a while to realize, but um, I guess I've always chosen topics that allow me to reflect critically on issues that I'm encountering in the present.
Okay.
So that's one of the things that archaeology does. It allows you to address and think through in quite a safe way, because you're thinking about this with a data set of, relating to people who are mostly long dead. So you're able to think through issues that maybe are bothering you or you're encountering in the present. So, I mean, I think about an example myself there. I did my PhD, I don't know, 30 years ago now, more or less, not quite, 25, 30 years ago, on Bronze Age houses. And I happily did my PhD and I, wrote a few papers about Bronze Age houses. And then it was only later that I realized that the reason I was interested in Bronze Age houses was because I had been trying to tease out ideas of the domestic domain and domestic practice and how that related to gender and gender identity and gender ideologies. And I only really realized that, oh yeah, I was interested in Bronze Age houses because I was trying to kind of critically address gender ideologies in the present around, women and, the home and work and the things that maybe were bothering me, in my early career. And I suppose in my early married and family life, these were things that were probably, I was thinking about subliminally, but somehow
Yeah.
it didn't, didn't make the connection. I was like, oh yeah, that's why I'm interested in Bronze Age roundhouses, because I'm using this data set in prehistory to think critically about how we live today and issues that we encounter today and how life maybe might be different. So I
Yeah.
think that's one of the really nice things for me about archaeology is it opens up kind of worlds that are different to ours. And they're not, more primitive or whatever. They're just different. People
Yeah.
lived in different ways in different periods. And I think seeing that kind of opens your eyes and it makes you think, well, maybe we're not stuck in a particular, we don't have to live in a particular way. Maybe some of the more harmful aspects of contemporary society can be undone if we understand how people in the past interacted with the environment or how, gender relations might have been differently structured in, other societies and other times. So it opens out a kind of sense of playful possibility, where you can think about other ways of living and other ways of interacting with the world. And again, that's really therapeutic and positive for your mental health because you don't feel, firstly, it's a kind of an escape because you can think, you can kind of, yeah, I suppose at some level it's a bit of a fantasy. I'm sure I project my fantasies of gender equality onto the Bronze Age. But, there is that element. It does allow you to escape, get out of your contemporary context and think about different ways of living and being and that maybe can give you hope for the future. I'm thinking about, for example, more around the climate crisis and the ways in which people interact with the environment and animals and so on. That hasn't always been this way.
So like if we're talking about a scale of 1 to 10, all right. So this is a bit of a fun question. So any archaeologists out there listening, please don't get offended with this. But how on a scale of like, say, if The Dig, did you ever see that film on Netflix?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
if that's number 1 and Indiana Jones is number 10, what are we talking about in terms of like just sheer excitement on site?
You'll have to explain to me now. You mean number 1, as in it's quite calm, relaxing, and people there in their nice hats and dresses.
Yeah, that's the kind of.
Yeah, it's definitely more towards the number 1 scale.
Okay.
But having said that, firstly, if every excavation turned up something like the Sutton Hoo burial, we would be far from we'd be very, very excited.
Yeah.
And I suppose, in terms of the realities of the archaeological profession, I'm really lucky because I work in an academic context, which means that most of the excavations I'm involved in are research excavations. So they are at a more kind of relaxed pace. But most archaeologists would work in the commercial sector. So they're working in advance of construction activities. So there would be, there'd be a lot more pressure on them. And I have colleagues working in big gravel quarries in southern and eastern England who, they have they're there excavating and they've got these massive machines kind of driving around them. It can't be very relaxing.
No.
So it totally depends on what you're doing and the context in which you're working and so on.
I think that's fair. And I think as we were talking before, and it's not even something I really thought about, because I was thinking about how maybe our perception of archaeology, because it's such a huge thing in films. You when you look through, I really like films and I watch like as many as I can. But archaeology comes up quite a lot in it. And I know it's obviously looking back at history and the past and stuff. But you mentioned even about gaming and about how we love to think of medieval times, and look back at these kind of things. And people get dressed up and, they have those kind of cosplay kind of stuff. And it's fascinating, like, why we want to be part of that world, like, because it's often the thought of, we don't want to think about that stuff, and we're brought into a museum as young people and we're like, oh God, when are we going home? But then we pick up a computer game that's based like, why do you think that is? Why do you think we still kind of have this kind of element of wanting to be part of that world?
It's so true. I mean, it is true. And I think it's the difference maybe between the way that, I don't know, I suppose the kind of academic side of things or the museum side of things, archaeology is presented as a science, as if it's something, we piece things together and we try to scientifically work out what people, ate or wore or how they cooked or whatever in the past. And that's all absolutely true. But also, I mean, there is a very strong element of of imagination. I mean, in my view anyway, I think that's a very good thing. I mean, archaeologists would have quite different perspectives, and probably I'm at maybe the more extreme end of the scale, and that I suppose some archaeologists would be more empirical and they'd want to be, really sticking with the facts and, not wanting to make too many extrapolations. But I kind of feel, well, what's the point of archaeology? What's the point of the discipline if it's not to, if it doesn't meet some need in the present? So it has to, I mean, inevitably it does. I mean, I suppose traditionally the unspoken need that it met in the present was to tell us how evolved we are, how we are, the best, the most advanced civilization, in quotes, on the planet. And that's a great way of legitimating our way of being in the world. So I suppose, traditionally archaeology would have served, not overtly, I suppose, but subliminally would have served that purpose of allowing us to say, oh, we're at the top of some kind of evolutionary hierarchy. But I think, it can serve other purposes too. It can allow us to think about, as I was saying earlier, other ways of being, other ways of living. It can help us to think critically about, what we're doing in the present world and how we live as individuals and how we interact with others, and kind of living through those different fantasies allows us to think through different ways of being, I suppose. I'm thinking about people dressing up. Why do people like to dress up and wave swords around? I suppose, they can't do it in they can't do it in their day-to-day lives, but maybe it allows them to express some aspect of their personality and to explore that and think through what it means for them. So I don't know. I feel like archaeology shouldn't be a million miles away from all those other things too.
Yeah, I agree, and it just fascinates me how these things do come back every so often. You're watching something and you see this kind of moment where they're looking at archaeology and archaeology studies and accepting it in as part of the past. And it's interesting you talk about like how people will go down a certain route and they want everything to be precise and things, and that happens a lot in different like parts of life. but there has to be something, I think, in between where there's a slight bit of a, what way would I put it? A little bit of imagination brought into it as well, because we
Yeah.
can't know
Yeah.
exactly 100%
It
sure of
can't.
each thing.
No. And there's a messiness to it. I mean,
Mm,
certainly with archaeological evidence, it can be interpreted in quite a lot of different ways. So, there's a playfulness in putting together the evidence and thinking, how do I want to take it? Can I take it in this way or that way? What's the and I suppose it's fun as well trying to think about um what's the best, how do I bring the evidence together to put together the best interpretation, but also that your colleagues could take that apart if they wanted
mm,
to. They could look at things in a different way. So I suppose there's the kind of intellectual challenge of trying to support your vision of the past versus somebody else's. So absolutely, I mean, a lot of it is, maybe more than we like to admit to ourselves as professionals. Of course, there's a lot we can know, and there are really fantastic, amazing scientific archaeological science techniques out there that have really come on in the last number of years. But there's still a lot that we can't know, and I think that kind of space of uncertainty and that space for the imagination is really important in allowing people to enjoy being there and being with the material, with the objects and the sites, and just to a little bit of fantasy in life is
yeah,
something.
it's good. Yeah. How, like, I think a lot of people will find, on the news every so often we'll hear about something is found, that's pretty spectacular. Like I think Richard the Third was
Yeah.
obviously massive, and people will know all about that. But there's obviously other things that have been found that
Mm.
we've heard about. But like within the community, if you don't mind me using that term, but in the community, like how often is something found that is quite significant that I guess the general population wouldn't hear about?
Oh, yeah, pretty regularly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And like is there like a real excitement to that? Like, because I know your Bronze Age is your specialist kind of area and stuff like that,
Mhm.
but I'd imagine there's many, many areas that we're talking about within archaeology. Um, is there always an excitement for you when something is found? Because I think as
Oh,
someone who
yeah.
doesn't, if I don't know, I didn't even think of like the idea you just mentioned there about what people were eating back then. Like, that's just a simple thing to you, I guess, but not
Mhm.
something I think about. Like, so the excitement for you must be always there because it leads down a road where there's so many possibilities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it is the case that with new scientific techniques and so on, that we're learning more and more about people's everyday lives. Like, there's been quite a lot of work done recently on ancient DNA, so
Mm,
genetic analyses of uh, prehistoric cemeteries. So you could start to look at how people are related to each other.
mm,
Do you have a grave, if you've got a grave with an adult and a child, is that a parent and a child? Or are they not biologically related? And if they're not biologically related, what does that tell you?
yeah.
So you start thinking through those things. So yeah, no, absolutely. There are constant new discoveries. And I mean, I don't know, I think there's something really interesting about the kind of the thrill, the presence that an object from the past has when you encounter it is really powerful. And I mentioned to you before we came on air that I work a lot with also the archaeology of the revolutionary period.
Hmm.
And the power of those objects, they're not archaeological objects in the kind of normal way of thinking about those things, but they're really powerful objects. When you see them, you're kind of, and when you're told the stories around them, you're absolutely blown away by them. So absolutely, I have wow moments all the time. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm very lucky again, as I say, in my job to be in a position where I'm sure, there are plenty. We have plenty of humdrum administrative tasks to attend to in the university as well, of course. But I do have a fantastic job, and that kind of joy of hearing about other people's discoveries and so on is part of it.
How do you become involved in that, the 1916 Rising and stuff? Because obviously, like you said, you're a specialist in the Bronze Age. How does that come
Yeah,
about?
yeah, that was funny. So I was I had uh, I was working on Dartmoor, which is in southern Britain, many years ago now, probably, going back 18, 20 years ago. And we were excavating there. I was excavating with some colleagues from England. And that's a beautiful place. We're excavating Bronze Age sites. And it's just the most, talking about kind of landscape, the kind of therapeutic impact of landscape. That was just a lovely experience of being there in those fabulous wild landscapes, the kind of upland, moorland, away from people, sunny summers excavating there. It was just beautiful. But I took my daughter, who was a baby at the time, and she wasn't best impressed. And then I had a couple more kids, and I was just like, some people managed to take their kids away with them excavating, but I was never really able to do that. It just didn't work. They were too bored. It wasn't their thing, so it wasn't going to work for me. So I was looking for something to do closer to home. And I had been taking, for quite a few years, I'd taken our students into Kilmainham Jail to get them to, well, not only look at the architecture, it's an amazing building, so thinking about, I guess I was getting them to think about how monuments work, how buildings work, and also the kind of the power and the impact and the meaning of material culture, because of course there's the artifacts in the exhibition there. So I was getting them to think about those things in a more contemporary context, but then, they could apply that knowledge then to a Neolithic tomb or, a medieval castle or whatever. They could think about how architecture works and, all that kind of thing. But when I was in there, I was really struck by some of the internment camp craft work, the things that people had made while they were interned, not just after the Easter Rising, but then a little bit later as well, right through to the Civil War. And I was thinking, God, you could take an archaeological perspective on these objects. You could look at them as archaeological artifacts and try and put them in context and understand, who made them and why they were made and how they were made and what they meant and all that side of things. So so that's how I came to that. And then more recently, I have been looking at the archaeology of the revolutionary period in East Limerick. So looking at some of the sites down there. So again, that's really kind of mind-blowing stuff. You're down there hearing really, really powerful stories about, people's parents or grandparents or, relatives and what things that happened to them and things that happened in places. So again, there's that kind of connection to place, the safe houses where people were looked after or fed or whatever, the places where people hid arms after raids, or places where people were assassinated or shot in ambushes or things like that. These are all really kind of really powerful places, and the objects around those events are also really, really powerful. And like I was saying to you before we came on air, I suppose when I was doing, the craft work, looking at the craft work from the internment camps, because I wanted something where I could just pop into Kilmainham Jail and pop into the National Museum, look at their collections whilst my kids were in the creche or whatever, when they were little. And I was talking then to people about their objects, family heirlooms, and things that their fathers or grandfathers had made while they were interned. And what was really interesting to me is how they allowed people to kind of open up emotionally about the impact of the events of the period and to think beyond the kind of political narrative and to talk about the impact of internment or the impact of their fathers or grandfathers or great grandfathers or whatever experiences during those periods had on them, then and later during their lives. So whether they were, if they'd been interned, often people had really bad health afterwards, or when they were interned they really missed their families, and there was all this stuff about kind of lived experience and the kind of emotional impact of what happened that just doesn't appear in the kind of the historical narratives, or at least back then it didn't. I think probably since the centenary of all of these these events, obviously we've been much more used to talking about these events from different perspectives and thinking more about the emotional impact and the impact on, women and on children and so on. But when I first started doing that work, which would have been probably, I don't know, maybe around 2011, something like that, or maybe even earlier, actually, people hadn't really moved beyond the kind of traditional political narratives in the big history books. So hearing all these stories about people's lived experience was really mind-blowing. And I suppose for them, it's probably, for the descendants, I think it's probably quite also therapeutic to talk about aspects of their own history, their own personal history, their families' histories that were probably quite traumatic and impactful. And you have that sense of, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of transgenerational trauma, which can be spoken about, but more often is not spoken about, but still has an impact, even down through the generations. And objects kind of allowed people a way to open up about that, or to talk about it in a way that was maybe a bit safer, a bit different. And I've actually then, subsequent to doing that work, the other thing I've done, I mostly work on the Bronze Age, this weird sideshow. The other thing that I've done is I've brought people, descendants of those who were involved in the 1916 Rising, to North Wales to dig at the site of the camp where people were interned in the aftermath of the Rising. And that was an absolutely mind-blowing experience, probably for them and definitely for me. But just having, the sons and daughters, or grandsons, granddaughters, great-grandsons, great-granddaughters, grandnephews, grandnieces, there excavating the place where their relatives had been interned, and, finding bits of crockery or glassware, or bits of clay pipe, or even bits of clothing. There was that real kind of visceral connection, embodied connection with the past that you don't get from history books. And that was incredibly powerful. And for me, then also, I'm there in the field where this stuff happened, and these people are telling me about their relatives' experiences. And it was amazing, actually. I think two of the people, or three of the people even, had relatives who'd actually been in the same hut and must have known each other. There would have been like 1,600 people, men interned at that particular site at Bruck in North Wales. So just serendipity and happenstance, we ended up with people whose relatives would have known each other very, very well. They were interned together in the same hut, just by accident. So I don't know. So that's, I suppose that's a whole different kind of, again, kind of thinking about archaeology as therapy. So therapy in a different way,
Do you know, it's amazing that I don't line up episodes on purpose that these things will tie together, okay? Because I'm not that clever. But
I'm sure you are.
Well, I don't know. But when I had Maggie on last week, she bought this house. I think it was 11 or 12 years ago. Amazing house, gorgeous, but they were fixing the roof, so it was like very little right with the house when they bought it, and they took this piece of wood away, and underneath it was a man had written about Irish freedom, and he'd signed his name, and he'd signed 1901. I think it was 1901 that this man had written it.
Yeah, goosebumps. I'm getting goosebumps listening to you telling me about this.
But that's what I could get the kind of emotions from Maggie telling me. And then she goes out into like the stables, and there was like old pipe sets that were left out there. And on the wall, she described it as like kind of old time graffiti, but it was like people had written their names, but like in calligraphy, not the way we'd see graffiti now. But lettering. But it drew her back, like, because it seems it's in reach. Like you're talking about the 1916 Rising, it's in reach. Like, say, if my grandfather's father, and we can kind of relate that in our heads. If we're talking about Bronze Age, we're talking about our ancestors too, obviously. But that kind of closeness, that like, it's. I can understand why people are drawn to the human side of that, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You know, that
Yeah.
we can see those people in their clothes and these. You're right. Like every time anybody sees 1916, the immediately political thoughts pop in their head and what happened.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think about the human side of it, I guess.
Yeah, not so much. No, exactly. And that is really interesting. I think that yeah, what you're saying about the graffiti there in your last guest's house, I think that sense of how the past intrudes into the present and the kind of emotional heft of that is, I think, really interesting. And that's
Mm,
one of the things I'm trying to think about with the fieldwork that myself and colleagues are doing now down in East Limerick. Um, I mean, on the one hand, I'm really interested in the kind of oral histories that people, tell around particular sites and locations where things happened. But I'm also really interested in, how places almost kind of haunt the present, to
mm,
what extent do they still have this power in the present, and how do we respond and react to that? And how does that allow us to open out conversations about um experiences in the past that humanize people?
yeah.
So then they're not just excuse me, they're not just, the political other, the people on the other side,
Mm,
that they're human beings with all the kind of hopes and joys and fears and everything, that we would have. And I suppose that, so that's something, that it interests me. And to what, and I suppose to an extent it is relatively easy to do that and make those connections in with the more recent stuff. It is more difficult to do it in the distant past. And one of the things that often strikes me is how, if the media are talking about, some Bronze Age find,
mm.
I don't know, I can't think of any example off the top of my head, but they're always astonished to discover that people in the Bronze Age were just like us.
Yeah.
Oh, isn't there? I can think of one now. Isn't there a meme about Ea Nasser, he's this Mesopotamian copper
Yeah.
merchant,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I think there's a tablet, one of these, cuneiform, which is this ancient writing that they had in Mesopotamia, like thousands of years ago, in modern day Iraq and Iran. And on this tablet, which has been deciphered, he's complaining about the person who sent him inferior quality copper. And when this was translated and found, it made quite a bit of waves in the
Mm,
media, because they're like, oh my God, people always had the same problems in
yeah.
the past. And yeah, I don't know. I've been starting to think critically about that recently and thinking, why are we surprised about this?
Yeah.
Because people in the past, they're the same species. They have exactly the same social and intellectual capabilities. Okay, they hadn't invented, smartphones yet. But they're really, well, I suppose on one level they're the same as us and having the same capacities. On the other, they can also be really different culturally to us.
Of course. Yeah.
And that's one of the really interesting and provocative and, well, I suppose thought-provoking things that I enjoy about looking at the deep past, is trying to understand that sense of difference, and and I suppose thinking through how that sense of difference might allow us to critically assess the contemporary world, the
Yeah.
modern world, and how we live today, I guess.
I go back to what you said a little bit earlier about the idea of like we are the smartest people of all time, and we think of like the Bronze Age as people were still going around grunting and
Yeah, it's not the case. Exactly. Oh,
which is
exactly.
which is funny, and it's like it's not 100% like our fault. I mean, as in me thinking about it
No,
that way,
no,
because as
exactly.
we are fed this kind of stuff
We
like
are,
all
we
the
are, we
time.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose, they had different knowledge. You
Mm.
think about all the skill sets that have been lost. How many of us could make a beautiful wicker basket, for
Yeah.
example? I mean, I'm struck the odd time I go into, like an agricultural museum, for instance, down the country. There might be, an open farm, and they might have, all their old agricultural implements up on
Mm.
the walls. And okay, partly I'm an urban dweller, but probably, a lot of rural dwellers nowadays, the younger generation, probably wouldn't know what half the implements up on the walls from,
Of course.
the
Yeah.
first part of the 20th century, wouldn't know how to use them, what they use for. So there's we just have different levels, different areas of knowledge and expertise, I guess.
Of course, I was out in doing the She in Moat there recently, and it has those dwellings and those, I guess, those tools and the way people used to live. And I remember I went into a bedroom and I was kind of thinking, there's no way I'd sleep in there. And I kind of left. And then I was thinking like, well, you would if you're, you know what I mean? It's our creature comforts of like, I prefer my mattress or it's like silly kind of stuff like that. But how popular is like archaeology in UCD?
We have a good number of students across a few different programs. So we would certainly like more students. And I'm always thinking, my God, archaeology is a fabulous subject because it gives you all sorts of transferable skills. Because first year you become open to understanding and thinking about cultural difference and social difference. And obviously we live in a very diverse society. But you also learn about how to put together really fragmentary evidence and make a convincing narrative about that. So you're putting together different types of evidence and trying to think through what that might mean. And you're also learning how to communicate that evidence to different constituencies. So you might for one of your pieces of assessed work, you might need to make a poster about a site and try to communicate that to an audience that knows nothing about archaeology or those kinds of things. So I think there are a huge amount of, it's also a really diverse subject. I suppose what people don't really necessarily realize is it sits really between the arts and the sciences. It's kind of arts, humanities, social sciences. You could be doing anything in archaeology. You could be doing chemical analysis of sherds, or you could be looking at Mayan art. You could be doing anything from the very hard sciences to the very, very, arts and humanities end of the spectrum. So there's something in it for everyone.
Yeah.
And we're dealing with all of humanity and every aspect of humanity. So if you're interested in politics, economics, gender, animals, food, architecture, whatever it is you're interested in, you can do it in archaeology. It's a really, really wide subject. So we have probably around maybe 30-ish students in each year at undergrad level across. So you can do archaeology as part of a joint honours degree, either via the social sciences program. So you can do it with other social sciences subjects like sociology or politics or international relations or whatever. You can also do it in the arts programs as well. So you can do it with classics and art history. You can also do it with history or with English. So there's a few good combinations there that people can do it with. And then we have lots of master's programs as well. Some of which are open to people, or quite a few of which are open to people actually with no archaeological background. And one thing I should say is that we really like getting mature students. So if any of your listeners are thinking about a second career, we love our mature students who get fantastic. We get lots of fantastic students of all ages, but our mature students come to us with different life experiences and different perspectives, and they really give something to the classes because they're always really willing to talk and to offer interpretations and perspectives from their own life experiences, and from they would often have very specific sets of knowledge and skill sets and expertise that they'd come to an archaeology program with, and inevitably it'll be complementary in some kind of way.
I think it's like when I was reading up about you, just to get some sort of questions going like that sounded half intelligent, but the idea, that I suppose I had a kind of a certain idea of archaeology that was, history obviously was, the thing that I was connecting it to, but I didn't realize like even when you're talking about it being art, and then you realize like the Mayan, the art and that we'd see in the the caves that people have found and stuff. It's such a vast subject that I didn't realize. And I guess, look, if people don't look into it, they won't realize either, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think it's like exciting because when I was thinking about you talking about Bronze Age, but like that's not even scratching the surface of the stuff that people can kind of learn about.
No, absolutely. Anything material, any
Yeah.
material aspect of the past, right up to the very, very recent past is something that you can take an archaeological perspective on. That's for sure. And it tells
Yeah.
you about past society. And it tells you about present society as well, in the sense that um, kind of critically deconstructing how people in the present talk about the past tells you an awful lot about the present.
Yeah. Like,
Yeah,
uh,
sorry.
so sorry, it's just that idea where we're talking about, like, talking about through the ages of human beings, how we think of, people maybe 50, 60 years ago, how I might think of them, but then how a 20-year-old might think of them now would be
Yeah.
completely different. And we're always moving, like, we're always thinking about it differently and changing. And it's funny to think about how we're going to be looked at in a certain amount of time. And like, is everybody going to be going like, did they really spend all that time on their phones? Or whether that's, whether that's going to be the same thing by then.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Well, they find it hard to imagine us as human beings like them. Who knows?
Yeah, that is an interesting one. So
Yeah.
I always have to ask this, Joanna, because I think it's always nice to kind of round things up in this way. But like, if you have spare time, what would you do with it?
What would I do with it? God, so many things. There's not enough spare time. I do like, I have to say, at the end of the day, I do come home and I like cooking.
Okay.
So again, I think for me, I suppose being an academic, I'm thinking, spend all day thinking. So and obviously I do go digging, but very occasionally,
Yeah.
don't dig that often. So mostly I'm in front of my computer, doing this and that. So it's lovely to do something with my hands.
Yeah.
So I do enjoy cooking. And yeah, I like walking, I go running, I love any kind of history and culture.
Yeah.
Generally interested in, I love visiting gardens and houses and
Mm.
places. I just love um, visiting different interesting places. So I don't get to travel enough. I have to travel
Yeah. I
more.
think
I'm sure everybody's the same.
that's
So
hard. Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know, lots of things. And of course, kids always keep me busy though now
Of
they're
course.
older and mostly just want lifts places. So
Fair enough. And what, like, when you are cooking, because if people bring up cooking, I always have to ask, like, what do you like to like? Are you an ambitious cook, would you say?
no, no,
Okay.
no, no. Just an everyday cook. I just like again, it's the kind of therapeutic thing of kind of
Yeah.
hands-on, an hour of complete disconnect at the end of the day. So it just disconnects you from your work,
Yeah.
and brings you down to something that's grounded, that's, physical. Yeah, watering my garden, something that
Yeah,
is
like, I'm a big fan
nothing
of
near the garden.
washing the dishes. I
Oh
really,
yeah.
yeah, it's
Doing the
just,
laundry, any of that
yeah,
kind of thing. It's
mundane task. Because before we
very
start,
relaxing.
yeah, it is. Before we start recording, I like cut my hair and then I clean the house,
Yeah,
and because this is my day off, so it's
yeah.
like I'll sit down later on and I'll pick up a book
Mm,
and
mm,
read and
mm.
stuff like that, and that,
Oh yeah,
but
reading too. Reading's also
yeah,
good.
I mean, you have to, like, I'm reading a couple of books at the moment. I'm reading a
Yeah,
book on the history of Hollywood, and then I'm reading
yeah, yeah.
a biography of Nick Drake. But I do, in the evenings, just to calm things down, just to, before bed. I think it's important to just relax the mind, because I could imagine for you, as a kind of, like you said, as an academic, you're thinking all the time. There
Mm,
has to be
mm.
moments of just relax, taking that
Yeah,
brain of yours and just chilling out.
yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and walking in the hills or
Mm.
whatever is really good for that kind of thing. Just being outside again, because as I
Yeah,
say, although I get to be outside in the day job, it's really rare, to be honest. It would be lovely to do more of it.
yeah.
So to do it more regularly, I have to just go for a walk, and I do love walking.
I think the message we should let people know is to get outside, especially with the weather the way it is now. It's gonna get outside, do something. Is there any? But you mentioned at the start about books that your dad gave you, but is there any like entry point books into archaeology that you could recommend? Is there any, like, I know that's a tough question to ask because you probably had to go through a lot of books.
Oh my goodness, that's a very good question. Oh dear.
No, that's all right. There's probably like
so many of them, far too many.
Well, it's a bad question because I guess there's different branches, like we said.
Yeah, there's a lot of introductory textbooks in archaeology, but they're probably more for students, I guess. Yeah.
Just watch The Dig, I suppose.
Yeah. I'm annoyed about how they
okay, just imagine.
Get me started on that one.
I would say there's 4 films that I didn't finish. That was very lucky not to be the 5th because and it's not because I wouldn't know if they're doing things right or wrong on it or whatever, but it just, I don't know, there's just something draggy about it, you know.
I enjoyed the film, but I felt very annoyed about how they represented Peggy Piggott, who was actually really interesting, amazing woman, archaeologist in her own right. So she's presented in a just quite a lackluster kind of way. She's a bit flighty, she's a bit light. She was a serious academic who did amazing work, particularly in the interwar years. You know, she was academic in her own right, as an expert in her own right. And that's just taken away from her in that film, which is a bit frustrating.
It wouldn't be like the film industry to, misrepresent women.
No. It would never happen.
But Joanna, it's been absolutely a joy and a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you so much for doing this.
No problem at all. It's been really lovely to chat. It's always great to natter on about archaeology.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind, Joanna, could you stick with me for a minute? I'll just close it out. We'll take a quick photo and we'll be on our way. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Brilliant. I also have to thank the usual suspects, John, for the tech support that he does. I always thank my mum, my dad, my granddad during Calvin. Subscribe on YouTube if you haven't done so already. That'd be very nice. It helps in the old algorithm and all that stuff. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and then the podcast platform, Spotify, Apple Anchor, Google Podcasts, a couple more ones that I can't ever remember. And yeah, most importantly, thanks everyone for watching, listening. And once again, Joanna, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. We'll see you next week. Take care. Bye.